Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Leslie Black, and I'm one of the chairs of the SAGE Committee. SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, is a program of the J of Metro Detroit that brings interesting and enlightening speakers to the community year-round. We are joined by the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and JLearn in presenting tonight's guest and conversation partner. Sage is endowed by a generous gift from Sis Maisel and supported by Carol and Ronald P. Fogel, Sherry and David Jaffa, and Elaine and Michael Serling through the Jay's Pillar of Light program. We thank all our donors for their continued support. Sage has a wide range of free events over the next several months, including co-sponsoring the upcoming Israeli film series in February and March 2023, with two Frankel Institute fellows from the University of Michigan's Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and a fascinating point-counterpoint conversation on anti-Semitism with Dr. Howard Lupovich and David Bernstein on Thursday, March 23rd, 2023 at 7 p.m., all in the Berman. We have a fascinating event for you tonight, and we want you to be a part of it. You can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers have a great discussion prepared, and they will take as many of your questions as they can. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you'll never miss any of our exciting virtual events. Tonight's speaker is Graciela Mochkofsky, author of The Prophet of the Andes. She will be joined by conversation partner, author, and journalist, Eyal Press. Graciela Mochkofsky is the author of 6 books of nonfiction in Spanish. She is a contributing writer for The New Yorker. Her work has appeared in the California Sunday Magazine, the Paris Review, the Jewish Forward, and numerous publications in Latin America and Spain. She was a Nyman Fellow at Harvard University, a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, and a Prins Foundation Fellow at the Center for Jewish History. She is the Dean of CUNY's Newmark J School. She lives in New York City. Eyal Press is a writer and journalist who contributes to The New Yorker, The New York Times, and other publications. He's also a sociologist with a PhD from New York University. His book, Beautiful Souls, was a New York Times editor's choice and has been translated into numerous languages. A recipient of the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism, he has also received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, a Cullman Center Fellowship at the New York Public Library, and a Puffin Foundation Fellowship at Type Media Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to The Prophet of the Andes with author Graciela Mochkofsky and conversation partner Eyal Press.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And Graciela, if you don't mind, since I'm posing the questions, I'm going to start out, first of all, just by showing everyone out there this beautiful book. I hope you can see it. Let's see if I put it more central. It's a beautifully designed book. It's a beautifully written book. It is a propulsive narrative and a work of history, journalism, and really an impressive piece of writing. And just I was awed as I was reading it, thinking of the fact that we are reading it in translation, because of course it was written in Spanish, your native tongue, and anyway, maybe we can talk a little bit more about process and the writing and the translating a little later. But I thought we'd begin by you telling the audience just the basics of this extraordinary and sweeping story that you tell in this book.
Thank you. Thank you for your words. And I'm so happy to be joining this community and to be in conversation with you, Eyal. So the basic story of the book, this is a story that has a lot of twists and turns that seems to have an ending and then has another ending and then seems to have another ending. So it's a story that is very rich in detail and in plot. But the basic story is the story of Segundo Villanueva, a Peruvian man who lived in a very remote hamlet in the Peruvian Andes, in the north of Peru, who, after his father was murdered in the mid-40s, inherited a Bible, a Protestant Bible that was hidden in a trunk. He found this Bible. It had been in the possession of his father, and starts reading this Bible. He was 17 then, and spends the rest of his life reading these books again and again and again, trying to understand what God is telling him. And he knows that in this book is the secret on how to live his life and what the true God, who the true God is, or what is he telling him. And by trying to find this meaning, he abandons the Catholic Church of his birth. He was in Peru at that moment. The majority of the population was Catholic, like most of Latin America. He starts looking into Protestant churches. He becomes an Adventist, a Seventh-day Adventist. Then he abandons that church he creates his own church in the Amazon jungle. He moves from the Andes to the jungle. And then when he's there, through a series of things that happened, he finds Judaism. And so the second part of the book is his life as a Jew. So he creates his own Jewish community. He starts living Orthodox Jew with the help of only a few books. And he's not accepted by the local Jewish community in Lima, in the capital of Peru. But in the 80s, he's converted by a group of Israeli rabbis, and his community, Segundo and his community, finally are taken to Israel, and they are settled in a Jewish settlement in the north of the West Bank. And so that's basically the narrative. So it goes from this hamlet in the Andes to the settlements in the West Bank, and from Catholicism to Orthodox Judaism.
Graciela, you say early in the book that your engagement with this subject began, I believe, in 2003. And in a sense, there's a mirroring of this extraordinary journey you're describing of this prophet of the Andes, and your own journey to kind of figure out, what happened and the story. I wonder how much you were propelled to do this and to pursue it by your own personal background and history, which you describe very briefly at the beginning of the book. You allude to the fact that your mother is Catholic and your father is Jewish, and you were given Catholic schooling, and you reached a point, I think, somewhat later in life, where you abandoned Catholicism and you became more curious about your Jewishness. And you have a very recognizably Jewish name, at least in Latin America, and I think in this country as well. Do you think that this was in some ways propelled by some kind of personal fascination that is reflected in your own personal history? This story, to find this man who suddenly, through all these twists and turns, decides he's going to be Jewish.
So I think so. I found this story. I'm from Argentina. Where and I grew up with his family. So my mother is from Paraguay, from a Catholic family. And I really grew up with my father's family, but I was raised as a Catholic, and as you mentioned. And so there was something when I found this story. I found this story in the internet. I was looking for actually something different. Well, I wasn't looking for this story. I was looking for information on the the Jewish experience in Latin America. I had just finished another book, a biography of Jacobo Timerman, who was a major publisher in Argentina and a major Jewish figure in the 60s and 70s. And so I had become very interested in Jewish life in Argentina and politics and how that connected with the country's identity and my own identity. And so I found this story, and I was really compelled to follow this story first because I thought it was an extraordinary story. So I'm a journalist, and I think I can recognize a great story when I see it. And I thought it was unique. No one had told this story. So that was my main kind of impulse. But then I really found when I started doing interviews, and it took me a long time to finish the interviews for this book because I had to do a lot of traveling. Which is not easy if you live in Argentina at a time of inflation and when you're a freelancer. And so I could relate with their experience. For most of the members of Segundo's community, being accepted and as Jewish has been critical in their lives. They were not seen as Jewish. They were not, even when they were already in Israel. They are mestizo, they are Peruvian, they had an accent, they learned, Hebrew when they were there, really. And so they were being accepted and being seen as Jewish for them was really important for a long time, and for their younger people for most of their lives. So they struggle with these two, both, identities being of a very Catholic country and wanting to be Jewish. There was another thing, though, in the story that really that I can relate to, and is the fact that one of the ways in which you can read this book and in which you can understand Segundo's story is of somebody who's looking for the truth, and somebody who's he's trying to get to a truth that always escapes him, and every time he feels he has found the truth, there's something that happens, or something new, that some new interpretation that in doubt. So, and as a journalist, our job as journalists is to find truth in the world, and with the limited tools that we have, and our human experience is limited, but also the methodology of journalism. You were not in the room where things happen most of the time, and you have to reconstruct whatever happened. And so that desire, or that need to understand the truth in this world, is also something that, in a very, very different way and from a very different ideology, also to me felt like a connection with the story.
Can you tell us a little more about, without spoiling the plot, and I think it's an impossible plot to spoil because there's so much in it, but just how the forensic reading of the Bible that he finds in this trunk leads him to decide eventually Judaism, because as you said in the beginning, and as readers will discover, it doesn't start out that way, right? There's it's Catholicism throughout Latin America, but there are all kinds of Protestant sects around, and of course one of the appeals of Protestantism is the book is yours. You get to read the Bible and interpret it in your own way. You don't have to have priests, tell you what's in it and what it means. So tell us a little bit about why he doesn't just end up as an Adventist, or what actually turns this into a work of Jewish history. Really.
Yes, so that's a really great question. So for him, this is a young man his father was a peasant. He was not in an intellectual world, and he finds this book, and he opened this book as you open any book, at the beginning, and he starts reading. That's not how most people read the Bible, right? And most scholars read the Bible, but he reads the book from the beginning to the end, and what he finds at the beginning, it really moves him, and that's what starts his conversion, this conversion that will take the rest of his life, which is that he finds there's a few ideas that he finds in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis, and those are the idea of el sábado, the Sabbath, that he hasn't encountered before, and he sees that everyone is worshiping and going to mass on Sundays. And he finds the idea and the name of Israel, and the idea that God has had this special connection with these people, and they were named Israel, and he doesn't know where they are. He feels like for a long time he thinks these people are not in the modern world, that they are only in this book, and the connection has been lost. And he finds a very clear contradiction between the New Testament. This is a Protestant Bible, right? So it has an Old Testament and a New Testament. And when he gets to the New Testament, which is more familiar to him as a Catholic, he finds a lot of contradiction. And the main contradiction he finds is that the New Testament says that the law, the law of Moses, doesn't need to be, which was eternal in the first big part of the book in the Old Testament, after Christ dies, is not, you don't have to follow that law anymore. The law is not a mandate anymore because of, of Christ. And he feels that's a huge contradiction. And he spends a lot of the time that he spends, and that's half of his life, that he spends looking for answers within Protestant sects and groups and churches. He's just trying to fix that contradiction and to find the answers that he needs. And what happens is that when he finds Judaism, he realizes that he's been looking in the wrong place, that the contradiction is actually exists because Jesus wasn't the Messiah, and the Messiah hasn't yet arrived. And so he decides, and there's a transitional moment when he decides they are Jewish and they're going to be Jewish from now on. And but he keeps Christ in the mix, and he still believes that he's the Messiah, and he goes to rabbis and he tries to reconcile those ideas. And finally he realizes that everything he understood in his first reading it's what's true, and that he has been confused and deceived by these Christian ideas, because what's wrong with Christianity. And he does this very symbolic action. He takes this action where he and everyone in the community, there are around 200 people by then, and they rip the New Testament off their Bibles and they bury them, and they call that a circumcision of the Bibles. All the men have already been circumcised. They realize that circumcision is of the flesh and not of the heart, which is one of the contradictions they have found between the Old and the New Testament, throughout decades of reading. And so they take this very dramatic action, and they just rip it off and bury it, and they just stay with the Jewish Bible.
That's a very dramatic moment in the book. Another really dramatic one, kind of wrenching moment, I thought, was so we get to the part of the book where, okay, he's decided it is Judaism. That's my faith. That's what the true faith is, and that's the community I want to join. And he and his followers go to, you describe in the book, the established Jewish community, small but prosperous and well-established community of Jews that settled in Peru. Can you describe how this interaction goes when he finally, comes to the rabbi and says, hey, this is our faith. We're with you.
Yes.
It doesn't go so smoothly.
No, and that's a big part of. There's a whole chapter on that relationship, and to explain that relationship, I had to explain the history of the Jewish experience in Peru, which is not so different from that history in most Latin American countries, where Jews are a very small community. In this case, by then, were around 4,500 people in total. They were 0.01% of the population or less. So what happens is that he actually gets to Judaism because he is looking for, there's a moment, and so languages and translation is a very big part of the book. And the fact that this book, you read it in translation, to me, it's really organic to the narrative, and it's just perfect to the way that he experienced reading the Bible, because he realizes at one point, so he's trying to do a quite literal interpretation of the Bible. And at one point, he comes to, and he knew that there were many different Spanish language editions according to the churches. And so he had, and he's had many different, all of the Spanish language Bibles that they could find. So he, in a way, knew he was reading different translations, but he hadn't thought about the fact that the original translation into Spanish had used sources that were in his mind that would be contaminated, because the first translation of the Bible during the beginning of the Protestant Reform movement was based on was available for the translator then. And he finds this document in which that translator says that he has used, Hebrew versions, but also and Greek versions, but he has also used the Vulgata, that was, the Latin version from the Catholic Church, and that readers should be careful because this translation might be riddled with errors and with, misinterpretations. And so that moment was very critical for him, and he starts doubting the text. And so he says, I need to read the original. So he goes to Lima, and he learns that the original, is in Hebrew, and then and in Greek, and he can't find that. And finally, he finds a Hebrew translation, but he can't read it. And so he goes to this Protestant bookstore, and he asks about the Hebrew language. And so that's where he's sent to the synagogue. They said, oh, Hebrew, that you need to talk to the Jews. He doesn't know they're in Lima. So he walks, and it's 3 blocks away. So he walks to this synagogue. It's the Sephardic synagogue in Lima. And he knocks on the door, and the rabbi opens the door. And then the rabbi, that was years before I talked to the rabbi, but the rabbi had a very clear recollection and memory of that moment. And the surprise finding this man who says, that he wants to know about Judaism, and that he wants to learn Hebrew because he wants to be Jewish. And so in that moment, there's this, cultural, kind of disconnect between these two experiences. And the rest of the relationship with the Jewish community in Lima is really complicated because the community doesn't want to accept him into the community, does not want to accept the 200 people behind him into the community. They don't know first what he wants. There's a very, very deep class gap between them. Segundo is poor and mestizo, and from the Andes, from the mountains, and the traditional Jewish community are, middle class, upper middle class. They live in mostly two, wealthy neighborhoods in Lima. It's a very close-knit community. It's a community that has had a very successful assimilation into Peruvian culture and life. And they don't want to accept this provincial, mestizo, newcomers. And so they never accept them. But they do, some people there feel really strongly that that it's a mitzvah to help them, because they are really determined to learn about Judaism. And they seem to be very honest in their desire that they're really looking for the true, religion in their mind. And so some of them, so it's a very nuanced story, really. So the majority do not accept them into the community. They don't want to accept them into their synagogues, but some of them want to help them, and they do help them, and they do help them to create the connections that finally led to their conversion.
You say at various moments in the book that Segundo and his followers strike the Jews they meet as more Jewish than Jews, right? They're so authentic, and they're so passionate about their faith, but also that there's a real skepticism about letting them in, and often a resistance, and that continues in the phase of the book where Segundo and his followers start thinking about going to Israel. Tell us about that, and another sort of hoped for, I think, idyllic welcoming and community that doesn't go quite as planned.
Yes, so they Segundo has been looking for Israel since he was 17 and read the Bible for the first time. He has been looking for that people. And then he finds them in the Jewish people, but then he's not accepted by them. And for a while, he decides, they just moved from the jungle and they move into the Pacific coast. There had been an agrarian, I don't even know how to say that, reform in Peru. And so you could actually, at that time, take land and build your town there, and without having to purchase the land. So they go to this place, this outside of this industrial city in Peru, and they settle there. They want to be away from the Christian world, and they want to live and worship and have their own, religious community without being contaminated and judged by their Christian neighbors. And so there they are, and learning by, just using 2 books. They get, one of the books is Tradiciones y Costumbres Judías, so Jewish customs and traditions, which is a thin book that Latin American children used to, that's where they learn for their bar mitzvahs. And it's a traditional book. The translation is, it's written by an Argentinian, actually, Jewish writer. And they study from this book, and then they study from a Spanish abbreviated version of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the code of Jewish law. And they learn from these 2 books, and most of what they know about Judaism is from these 2 books. And in this book for children, it's a very there's this depiction of Israeli life and how Jews live in Israel that is very romantic and very idyllic. And it's all these descriptions about how in this Jewish country that was created by Jews, you can actually, the entire country goes out into the streets to celebrate some holidays, and people, dance in the streets, and people are, and everyone is your people. And they are struggling to make, a living in Peru in a time of very high inflation and political upheaval. And they're trying to build their own synagogue, and they can never find the money and the resources to find it, to even, finish that building. And that takes years and years. And then the opportunity comes to go to Israel. And at the beginning, Segundo is not, and they realize they need to convert to go to, that's another very important moment in the book. For Segundo, for a long time, it was just God who needed to accept them as Jewish. It was just a relationship, their relationship with God. It's a very pro idea, right? And so then they realized that that doesn't work like that. That if you want to be part of the Jewish people, you need to go through conversion, because you were not born Jewish, and and you were not raised as Jewish. They need to go through this process. He resists us for a moment, but then his son and his community, they really want it. So he accepts to go through that. And then they finally get converted. And once they're converted, they have the right to go to Israel. And so they're taken there. And, that's like the last part of the book before the epilogue, that there's a new surprise when they get there. They're so happy, and they get there and they start understanding that it's a very complex place, that they are also taken to a very complicated place at a moment in which they are in the middle of this conflict that they didn't really know about before they were taken there. And that they also have to choose a congregation. They need to choose what kind of Jews to be, which is a very alien idea for them for a while. And there's this moment that is kind of, comical in a way, if you know about, Jewish culture, where a rabbi sits with them in this settlement in Elon More in the West Bank, and says, well, you need to choose which synagogue you're going to attend and which congregation, which community you're going to be part of. And they said, we just want the unity of the Jewish people. We don't want Jews to be divided in groups. We want it to be just one happy group, And so there's a cultural clash there too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, that section of the book. And you mentioned just now one of the sort of fascinating details, that they eventually do make Aliyah, come to Israel. They're converted, they're brought in, but they don't wind up in Tel Aviv or Haifa. They wind up in Elon Moreh, as you mentioned, and Segundo himself, I believe, eventually at Kfar Tepuach, which is a settlement, and actually very well-known one. I've been there as a reporter, a very militant settlement, a settlement that has a history of extreme politics.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about that and why they wound up there, of all places, and how it worked out. Again, without spoiling.
Yes. Oh, I mean, I don't think that there's a way to spoil this story. I mean, I can just tell you all of it, and there you'll find so many more details. So the way, what happens is that the rabbi there's a whole chapter which I really loved to. It was wonderful just to reconstruct that story, all of the connections. One connection takes to the other, takes to the other, to the other, to the other, and all of these advocates for them. It's a full chapter of people advocating for them, and how they go to the great rabbi, and how they're rejected, and how the Segundo's son learns to write in Hebrew just to send letters so that they can be converted. And so there's a long series of connections and circumstances that need to take place for them to finally receive in Peru this Beidin, this tribunal, 3 rabbis who are going to convert them. And the head of that conversion tribunal is they don't know this then, but he does have a political agenda, and he's part of the settler movement, and he is very involved in the Gush Emunim movement, and in this movement to towards the greater Israel, and to have the biblical land settled by Jews. And they start learning that really when they're in Israel. But this rabbi, who's the one who accepts, who listens to them and accepts to convert them, so they're really grateful to this rabbi and the other rabbis that go with him. Eliyahu Abihail was his name. He was actually he passed late in 2018. But he was he's famous in Israel, or he was famous in Israel, because he was connected with, he was like a seeker of lost tribes. And so he was very much involved in bringing descendants, alleged descendants of lost tribes into Israel, including the Bnei Menashe community. Maybe here somebody who's listening to us would know about that story that's very well known in Israel. And so it's this rabbi, Abihail, who tells them that if they want to stay together as a community, once they are in Israel, then a settlement choice for them, because they will accept them as a community. They won't have to be scattered in different towns. And it's also more affordable, and it's also religious. And they are told that, which is a surprise to them at the beginning, that a big percentage of the Israeli Jewish population are actually secular, and they want to live as religious Orthodox Jewish, of Jews, and so they really don't want to be in a secular environment. So they, choose to go there, but because they are told that this is the place where they can actually have these two things together, and a religious environment that is, the same that they want and they be living in, and also they can be together as a community. And they're really, the community is really happy to receive them, and it's a very successful for them. For this first group, Segundo and 95 people are converted in the first group, and then more people will be converted afterwards, and so to a total of about 500. But this first group has a very successful assimilation, and they are well received. They end up abandoning Segundo as their leader, because they find that most people there know more about Judaism than Segundo ever knew, and they end up choosing a synagogue and a rabbi to go to for advice, and they married local people, etc. And Segundo and his brother, but maybe that's for your next question, they are the ones. They end up feeling not a good fit. They feel it's not a good fit for them. And for Segundo, that's not the end of his story.
I do want to ask about that, but I also want to invite members of the audience to type questions. We do have a comment, and as you're listening, we're going to soon open it up to audience members who have questions. And rather than ask about the very last section of the book and what Segundo ends up deciding to do when he feels it's not such a good fit to be in Elon More as his destination, I wanted to ask you about one of the things that seems strikingly absent in the Judaism of Latin America, of this particular Latin American Judaism that you're describing, the one that was born through this kind of search for an answer to what is the true faith, and that's a memory and history of persecution. It doesn't figure largely in, it seems, in the mindset and the sort of culture of this community. And I wonder if that's changed, as the community is sort of, in a sense, assimilated, or if it's still very much the case. And towards the end of the book, you allude to the fact that these kinds of communities have sprung up across Latin America, Colombia and Venezuela, and country after country, Mexico. Is there more of fluidity on that, and incorporation of the Holocaust and other sort of central events in modern Jewish history that kind of anchor this identity, or is it really not connected to that still?
So, for Segundo and for his community and all of the Peruvians who converted, there is a memory and a history of discrimination that is very different, and of colonization and oppression. The book starts really when the book starts 500 years earlier, when the Bible comes to America, to Latin America, what's now Latin America, to Peru, and in the town in which Segundo will be born, almost 500 years later. And how this religion is imposed by force onto the people who are living there. But that's a very different history from, of course, the Jewish history of persecution, and there's so that's for Segundo. And then what you're referring to, and that's the subject of the epilogue of the book. One of the things I realized, so I did the reporting for the book and originally, and I ended when they got there and what happened in Israel with them. And then Segundo died in 2000, right? The book begins at the beginning and then it ends when he dies. And then I realized I started getting emails and hearing about new communities, new Jewish communities that were very similar to this one. The community that Segundo created ended up, the name they chose when they decided to be Jewish was named Moshe, so the children of Moses. And I started hearing that there were more communities like that in the region, first in Colombia, then I learned in Ecuador, then in Mexico, then in Brazil, and then in Central America, and then I ended up counting 62 communities in 14 countries. And I spent a few years going through that process. And what I realized is that Segundo was really a pioneer of a movement that he didn't desire, he didn't create by, he didn't mean to create. And that's, why the book is called The Prophet of the Andes. He's kind of an accidental prophet of this movement and this religious transformation in the region that of which he was a pioneer. And what we have now in the region is all of these communities that are going through a similar process, going from Christianity to Judaism, deciding to convert because of mostly because of biblical interpretation, because of some similar process than the one Segundo followed. And this is they are called the emerging Jewish communities. There's a few scholars now finally doing research on these communities and going deeper. But there's clearly, and this is known by the traditional Jewish communities in these cities and in these countries, there's this parallel emerging Jewish world. In some cities, these communities have more members than the traditional Jewish communities because they are very small, and they have and they're rejected by the traditional Jewish communities. So they have their own, and they're being converted by rabbis from different places, and they do not have a historical connection with Judaism. They do not have the cultural background. They are in Judaism, because of a religious connection and because of an interpretation of the Bible. And rabbis are, most of these communities have been approached by external rabbis, either from the US or from Israel, who are trying to compensate for that lack of, for that cultural vacuum, and are teaching them about this. And they're reading the books and they're learning about that. They're very much, pro-Israel, and they have a Zionist identity. Most of these communities dream with emigrating to Israel, which has become very complicated because of the, political, the politics of conversion in Israel now, and the religious authorities in Israel. But no, they do not have that history. They don't. There are some groups, there are some efforts now to connect those groups, to raise in these groups an idea, to kind of plant in these groups an idea that they might be crypto-Jews who are coming back to Judaism. So the history that we know in Latin America for Judaism, the first initial story is that we got a lot of, when the continent was, when it was colonized, when the Spaniards came and the Portuguese came, a lot of Jews were escaping persecution, and they came with these groups and with this, as part of this effort, and they needed to hide their Jewish identity. And so there's been this, kind of there's been this hidden Jewish identity in some groups that has then, when it became safer, decades and centuries later, has started to, kind of so the conversion does not begin as as it's not groups who are claiming or reclaiming an identity that belong to their families. This connection is really being manufactured by some groups these days.
Fascinating, particularly fascinating that you described the existing Jewish communities in Latin America as shrinking and worried about their survival. And then these burgeoning new communities, but they don't see this, there's not acceptance of them for what you suggest are sort of class and race divisions that transcend faith. A couple of questions from the audience, from listeners. The first one is from Naomi, and she asks, "The writing in this book is gorgeous. Did you write it in English?" And the second question is, what was the reaction to the book in Argentina?
Thank you for those questions. Thank you for so I will tell Lisa Dillman, who's the translator, that Naomi found the writing beautiful. I think, so I wrote the book in Spanish. I do write in English. I write for the New Yorker, and I can write articles, but I couldn't possibly write this book in English. One, because it would have taken too long. I'm a slow writer in English, but also because I couldn't connect with the story in English. This story, to me, in my mind, it's I don't know, it takes place in Spanish, and I try to use the Spanish that Segundo and his community use. It's beautiful. Peruvian Spanish is one of the most, in my opinion, beautiful Spanish of all of the versions and variations of Spanish. So I try to convey that emotionally in the book, and I thought it was going to be more respectful to them. But the book in Spanish is coming out in Argentina and Spain, and hopefully will be distributed in the rest of Latin America in March next year. So there's no reaction yet. I'm still it's kind of funny that I wrote the book in Spanish, but I waited for it to be translated into English and to come out in English, and then we sold the rights to a Spanish publishing house, and hopefully it's going to come out also in a year or two in other languages.
There's a question from Mark, sort of a comment. He writes, "It seems to me as this movement starts is messianic, moves to traditional Judaism, turns to almost Zionist, and finally falls to modern messianic in Israel. What do you think?"
So I think the way I write is, and I think you also, having read Eyal's beautiful books, I think you also share this, that, I write without editorializing. I have a very strong opinions, political opinions, and, I'm not a religious person. This is the book of a journalist, really. I don't share these beliefs in God in the way that, he had them and the community had him. But I was, I did a really, my effort was to be faithful to the story, not faithful to any, religious faith, but to make it justice and to be respectful and to be fair. And I want the readers to come up with, I think, many different people. I mean, readers will read it will interpret the story in a different way. I think for some people, the story is the story of a messianic search, and there's all these historical connections that you can make with those ideas. For some people, Segundo might be a fanatic, and some people will really reject what they did, particularly because of where they ended. And maybe, I have a lot of Israeli friends who are, in the left, who were, who kind of, asked me when I started doing the book, why are you writing about these people? They are just part of the problem in Israel, things like that. So, and I didn't want to take a stand. And there was at least one review where this was noted as a defect of the book, like why she doesn't take a stand. She doesn't tell us what this means politically today. And I really made a big effort to not do that. I did that purposefully. I want readers to reach whatever conclusions they want, because I think there's so many ways to interpret this story. So I just really don't want to interpret it. Of course, I did a process of interpretation just by choosing the facts, right, and organizing the story. But I don't want to. I don't want to interpret it for. At least 3 ways in which you can. Did you lose me? Was I frozen?
Temporarily there, yes.
All right. So I was just repeating the same idea, so it doesn't matter. I was just saying that I just didn't want to offer my interpretation of what this means necessarily, because I want that to be the job readers.
Understood. There's a question about whether, actually, here's another question that's quite interesting. Is this community descended from the Marranos from Spain?
No, they're not. I mean, they never claimed. Okay, so wait, there's a more interesting answer, actually. So as I mentioned before, what drove Segundo and his community to Judaism was not a historical connection that they recognize or they claim. They did not claim any type of Jewish ancestry. They did not say we are descendants of the Marranos or crypto-Jewish or crypto-Jews, and we have read the Bible and we have come to this conclusion, to this realization that this is the truth. And a lot of the communities that are doing the same kind of journey are also not claiming. Originally, they were not claiming any type of ancestry. That started to change when this community and other communities and other converts started settling in Israel and arriving in Israel, and they realized that there was this prestige in saying you had Marrano or crypto-Jew ancestry, because that gave you a status that you did not have as a simple convert. You were seen as more Jewish in a way. And so for some people, then that became, they started looking for that connection. They started to and then one of the groups, which is part of the final chapter of the book, one of the groups that has been for the past 20 years trying to convert these people and take them to the settlements, an organization that is called Shavei Israel, which is now in trouble, but until recently they were very active with this. That organization actually created, they wrote a book that is called "You Have Jewish Roots, Tienes Raíces Judías," trying to tell people, trying to manufacture this connection and to tell people that they probably, if they wanted to be Jewish, it was most likely because they were descendant from, a Jew who was forced to, either abandon or hide their Judaism 500 years ago. And so, some people now say that because there's a lot of women in their family with certain names, for example, they might be descendants of Marranos or crypto-Jews. And I'm using both words because some people don't like Marrano, because Marrano has a negative connotation, but it's widely used in Spanish anyway. But what happened is that, so because of all of these things, one thing that happened at the end of the story, at the end of my connection with the story, was that Segundo's son, who's now a rabbi who lives outside of Tel Aviv, Yoshua, he decided that the only real possible explanation for what his father had gone through was that they actually did come from crypto-Jews. And so he started looking at that, and he did a lot of research, and he couldn't really find any proof. But he's holding on now to some customs in his family and the family, and his grandma and other family in this rural area in Peru that he thinks might have that connotation. So he's kind of claiming now that connection. His father didn't claim it, and it certainly did not play a part in his story until he died.
Graciela, your mention of the son makes me wonder. It's a sort of version of the question you were asked about Argentina, but Segundo is no longer alive. You mentioned that he died, pretty early on in your research process, but his children are, from what I understand, not just the son, but several daughters. Have they read the book? And what has been the reaction?
They haven't yet. I offered to send them the book in English, and Yoshua said that he wanted to wait for the version in Spanish, and so it's not printed yet. So I'm waiting for the actual book to be printed, send it to him. So I'll get back to you like next year.
All right. One last question. Levi Smith has a question, well, sort of an observation about this. This has not happened in the United States. Maybe they want to be in a better country. I don't know who the they is referring to there, but I just want to seize on the first part of that this has not happened in the United States. As far as you know, is that true?
It's not. Actually, it has. So there's actually, there's now several groups in Miami and in Puerto Rico who are actually gone through this process. Most of those are Latin American immigrants who have come here and who have found, created a community or found a community. Puerto Rico has a few of these emerging communities. And there's a great story that actually is not part of the book, but and I've never written about it, but that I learned when I was here. So I wrote, before this book came out in 2014, I think it was, I wrote a version, I wrote about the Colombian experience, which is fascinating because in Colombia, there's this large group. The largest Jewish community in Colombia is an emerging Jewish community. They are in Medellin, and they were a mega church that was taking on, that was saving sicarios or hit men for Pablo Escobar from the streets. And that group was a mega church, and they became Jewish, and they are the Jewish emerging Jewish community in Medellin is an amazing story. And I wrote about that story for the California Sunday magazine, and it was a big piece that came out in 2014. And so a lawyer reached out to me from Seattle. He was representing pro bono this Colombian family who was one family who had converted, had gone through the conversion in Colombia in another emerging Jewish community. And they had migrated to New York State, and they were living near Buffalo. And they had been in touch. They were Orthodox converts, but they met these Hasidic groups that live in upstate New York. And so they had become Hasidic. And so they were undocumented. And so one day they were coming from a Jewish holiday. I don't remember which one. They took a bus from this town. I think it was Monse, upstate New York, or one of those, going to Buffalo. And the ICE officers stopped the bus and start asking for documentation. They were looking for undocumented immigrants. And they looked at them, and they looked like Hasidic Jews. So they never expected them to be, but they asked for their document anyway. And this family offered their expired Colombian passports. And so they ended up in the ICE system. And so the lawyer was trying to save them for deportation. And so that's how I learned that there are some, communities and some families and some groups also, and there's probably more in this country because it connects with the, Latin American migration to the US. But I think what his question is, I don't remember the name of the person who asked the question again. Levi, sorry. So I think what Levi is pointing to is if this has an economic motivation, if there's some time of economic opportunity to go to Israel. And certainly it was not the case for Segundo and his community, but that was the case. And that's also part of the book for groups of people who were left behind when the Bnei Moshe, the community that Segundo created, when they finally settled in Elon More and Tapuach and the other settlements, they started sending letters back to their families who were Christian, who had been left behind. And that sparked an opportunistic conversion movement of people becoming Jews because they could emigrate and just escape poverty and get a better life. And I want to say, as an immigrant myself, who came from I won't compare with them. I'm a middle-class woman. I came here with a fellowship. I went to, Columbia, and, I'm a dean of J school now. I'm a very different situation, but I did emigrate from Argentina because I was looking for a better life for me and my child. So I pass no judgment on people who migrate. I feel, I have a special place in my heart for migrants because it's hard, even if you're privileged.
Thank you so much, Graciela. I just want to show the book again to the audience. If you haven't already purchased it, you should do so. It would make for a great holiday gift, actually. And I should say, like you, Graciela, I'm a very secular Jew, but that actually made the book even more interesting to me because I learned a lot about my faith, and then the sort of tenets of Judaism and how hard they make it to figure out what being Jewish actually means and how contested that is. So it's really fascinating in that regard. Thank you so much, and thank you to the listeners for this wonderful occasion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Graciela and Eyal, for being with us for such a wonderful, interesting discussion. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us this evening. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, jccdet.org/bookfair, for our full schedule and ways to get involved. See you next time.